The morning sun rose gently over the tall walls of the royal palace. Its golden light touched every corner of the grand courtyard, but the air inside the palace felt heavy that day. Servants walked quietly, guards stood in silence, and even the birds near the royal garden seemed to sense something unusual. The peace that once lived in those marble halls had been replaced by a strange, tense feeling that everyone could feel but no one dared to talk about. King Harold sat alone in his study room, looking out through the wide glass window that opened toward the royal garden. His tea had gone cold, and a pile of unread letters lay on the desk beside him. The king had not spoken much for days. His eyes were tired, and his heart was even more tired. For months he had tried to keep peace inside the palace, but now he was slowly losing his strength. Across the palace, Queen Camilla was in her chamber, surrounded by her maids in fine clothes. She had been the heart of every royal celebration, the charm of every guest visit, and the face of royal pride. But recently her charm had turned cold. She had grown distant from the king and was often seen whispering to her close attendants, leaving others curious and afraid to ask what she was planning. The royal guard, a loyal man named Thomas, stood near the main hall. He had served the royal family for many years. Everyone in the palace respected him for his honesty and calm nature. Thomas had seen everything: the early years of love between the king and queen, their laughter, and the happiness that once filled the palace. But lately all he saw were quiet glances, closed doors, and the growing silence between them. That morning, the palace felt different. A message had arrived from the royal lawyer, sealed with the golden emblem of the crown. Thomas had been the one to receive it. He held the envelope carefully, knowing that whatever was inside would bring change to the royal household. He walked slowly toward the king's study, his boots making soft sounds on the marble floor. When he reached the door, he knocked gently. The king's voice came after a pause, calm but tired. "Come in." Thomas entered and bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, a message has arrived from the royal lawyer." The king looked up slowly. His eyes met Thomas's, and in that brief moment the guard saw something he had never seen before: pain mixed with relief. The king gestured for him to place the letter on the desk. Thomas obeyed, then stepped back silently. For a long moment the king did not open the letter. He simply looked at it as if trying to gather the courage to face what he already knew. Finally he broke the seal and read the contents. His hands trembled slightly, but his expression stayed calm. After reading, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Thomas," he said in a low voice, "I have made a decision that cannot be undone." Thomas stood still, waiting for the king to continue. "Prepare the royal papers. They are to be delivered to the queen today," the king said. His voice was soft but firm. "This palace has seen enough of silence and cold hearts. It is time to end it." Thomas froze for a moment. He understood what the king meant. These were not ordinary papers. These were divorce papers. It was something no one in the royal family had ever imagined. The royal couple had been seen as a symbol of unity and grace, but now that symbol was breaking apart quietly behind the palace walls. "Your Majesty," Thomas said carefully, "if I may ask, do you wish for me to deliver them personally?" "Yes," the king replied. "I trust no one else with this. You will take them to her chamber. You will do it with respect. Let no one see them until they reach her hands." Thomas bowed deeply. "As you command, Your Majesty." The king looked out of the window again. The royal garden was bright with sunlight, but for him it felt like a long shadow had fallen across his life. For years he had tried to keep the marriage alive. He had been patient, kind, and forgiving, but love cannot live alone. It needs care, and that care had long disappeared. As Thomas walked out of the study, he felt the weight of the task he was given. Delivering an ordinary message was part of his duty, but delivering divorce papers from a king to a queen was something entirely different. He walked through the long corridors, his thoughts filled with questions he could not answer. In her chamber, Queen Camilla was standing before the mirror, adjusting her crown. She looked beautiful as always, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that had not been there before. She turned as Thomas entered the room. "Thomas," she said with a small smile, "you bring a message from the king?" Thomas bowed and handed her the envelope. "Yes, Your Majesty. The king asked that it be given to you directly." Camilla took the envelope slowly. The golden seal caught the light for a second before she broke it open. Her eyes moved across the paper. Her face, once calm and proud, changed as she read the words. Her fingers tightened on the paper, and for the first time in years she seemed lost for words. The room fell silent. The maids exchanged worried looks but dared not speak. Thomas waited quietly, his heart heavy with the tension in the air. Finally, Queen Camilla looked up. Her voice was low, steady, and touched with disbelief. "So it has come to this." Thomas did not respond. He knew his place was not to speak but to serve. "Tell the king," she said after a long pause, "that his message has been received." Thomas bowed once more and left the room. As he walked away, he could feel the weight of what had just happened. The message was clear, and the silence inside the palace was louder than ever. Back in his study, King Harold sat in the same chair, his eyes fixed on the empty space before him. He knew that by sending those papers he had closed a long chapter of his life. It was painful, but deep inside he felt something he had not felt in years: peace. Outside, the palace carried on with its daily life. Servants continued their duties, guards stood at their posts, and life went on as if nothing had changed. But everyone knew something had shifted. The king had spoken through silence, and that silence carried the sound of freedom. As evening approached, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and red. The king rose from his chair and walked toward the balcony. The cool wind touched his face, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to breathe freely. Inside her chamber, Queen Camilla sat alone, staring at the paper still in her hand. She was not used to being on the other side of royal decisions. She had always believed she could control everything with charm and power, but now she realized that even a crown could not protect her from the truth. The palace, once filled with laughter and celebration, stood quiet as the night settled in. The royal guard had done his duty, but the story of the royal family was far from over. Both the king and the queen were now standing at the edge of change, and what came next would test the strength of their hearts and the soul of the entire kingdom. The next morning arrived with a gray sky. The palace that once woke up to the sounds of laughter and music now opened its eyes to silence. The servants moved quietly through the halls, whispering to each other about what had happened. Rumors spread quickly, but no one dared to speak loudly. The royal family's troubles were always hidden from the public, but now it seemed that even the walls could feel the weight of the secret. Thomas, the royal guard, stood at his post near the king's study. His thoughts were not at rest. He kept remembering the look in Queen Camilla's eyes when she had read the papers. It was not anger, not sadness, but something else, a mix of pride and disbelief. She had always been strong and graceful, but in that moment she looked human, just like anyone else facing loss. Inside the study, King Harold sat by the window again. He had not slept well. His thoughts kept circling back to the years he had spent trying to make the marriage work. He had given his time, patience, and kindness, but all he received in return was distance. The queen had grown apart, lost in her own world of power and appearance. He had hoped things would change, but they never did. A soft knock came on the door. It was Thomas. The king motioned for him to enter. "Your Majesty," Thomas said with a respectful bow, "the queen has received your message. She did not send a reply, but she asked me to inform you that she read it." The king nodded slowly. "I understand." "Thank you, Thomas. You have done your duty well." Thomas hesitated for a moment. "Your Majesty, may I speak freely?" The king looked at him kindly. "You may." Thomas took a small breath. "I have served you for many years. I have seen your patience and kindness. Whatever happens now, I hope peace finds you again." The king gave a faint smile. "Peace is what I am searching for, Thomas. Perhaps now it might find me." As the guard left the room, the king leaned back in his chair. He looked around the study that had been his place of comfort for so long. On the wall hung a painting of him and the queen from their younger days. They had been smiling in that picture. He stared at it for a long moment before standing up and gently turning the frame to face the wall. In her chamber, Queen Camilla sat near the window, staring at the gardens below. She had not eaten or spoken much since she received the papers. Her maid Anna stood nearby, unsure of what to say. "My lady," Anna said softly, "you should have breakfast. You have not touched anything since yesterday." Camilla looked at her reflection in the mirror. "Anna, do you know what it feels like to lose something before you even realize it is gone?" Anna looked down. "No, my lady," Camilla sighed. The king was never loud, never harsh. He always spoke softly, even when I ignored him. I thought his silence was weakness, but now I see it was his strength. Anna did not reply. She quietly set the tray of food down and stepped back. Camilla stood and walked to her desk. On it lay the divorce papers, neatly folded. She picked them up again and read them carefully. The king's words were simple, clear, and full of calm dignity. There was no anger, only truth. She read the line that said, "This decision is made in peace, with respect for what once was, and hope for what may come next." Those words struck her deeply. For the first time, she felt what the king had felt all along, the quiet pain of trying alone. Later that day, Thomas received another order. This time it came from the queen. He was told to deliver a letter to the royal lawyer. The queen was not fighting the decision. She wanted the process to be done properly and privately. As Thomas rode through the palace gates to deliver the letter, he noticed the people outside. The townsfolk looked up at the palace with curiosity. They did not know what was happening behind the walls, but whispers had already started spreading across the city. Some said the king was ill. Others said the queen had fallen from favor. A few even said the royal couple was planning to leave the kingdom. No one knew the truth, but everyone could sense change coming. When Thomas returned, he saw the king walking in the royal garden. The king often found peace among the trees and flowers. Thomas approached quietly, not wanting to disturb him. But the king noticed him and smiled gently. "Thomas," he said, "do you know why I come here every morning?" "No, Your Majesty. It reminds me that life continues to grow even after storms. These plants do not hold grudges, they just keep reaching for the light." Thomas nodded. "That is wise, Your Majesty." The king looked up at the tall oak tree nearby. "I planted that tree with her on our wedding day. I thought it would stand as long as our love. Perhaps it still will, even if we do not stand together." In the following days, the royal staff tried to go about their duties as usual. But everything felt different. The palace musicians played softer tunes, the cooks prepared simpler meals, and even the guards spoke less. Everyone could feel the sadness, but they also felt a strange peace settling in. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla began spending her time writing letters and sorting through her belongings. She stopped attending royal meetings and avoided the grand hall. Many of her close friends had left the palace, sensing that her power was fading. One evening, she asked Anna to bring her a box from the old storage room. Inside were letters from her early days as queen, letters the king had written to her. They were filled with warmth, care, and dreams of building a happy home together. She read them one by one, her eyes softening with each word. She remembered the early years when the palace was full of laughter. The king would surprise her with simple gifts like a flower from the garden or a walk by the lake. Those memories felt like another lifetime now. Camilla realized that somewhere along the way she had begun to care more about her image than her heart. She had listened too much to the voices of advisors and guests and too little to the quiet voice of the man who loved her most. That night, she walked to the balcony. The moon was shining bright, covering the palace in silver light. She stood there, looking toward the king's tower. From the distance, she could see a soft light glowing in his room. For a moment, she wished she could go back in time, to the days when love was simple and hearts were still open. But she knew it was too late. Some mistakes could not be undone, only understood. In his room, King Harold also stood by the window, unaware that the queen was watching from afar. He was holding an old music box she had gifted him long ago. It still played a soft tune when opened. As the melody filled the room, he closed his eyes and smiled sadly. Both of them stood under the same moonlight, silent, each lost in their thoughts. Though words were no longer shared between them, memory spoke louder than anything else. The palace clock struck midnight, marking another day gone by. The next morning, the official process would begin, and the royal lawyer would make the separation public. The kingdom would soon know what had happened behind the palace walls. For now, the king and queen stood apart, facing the truth of their choices. And though the silence between them was heavy, it also carried a quiet hope that maybe in letting go, both could finally find the peace they had lost long ago. The next morning began with quiet movement in the royal palace. The golden flag of the kingdom waved softly above the towers, but everyone inside knew the air carried something different now. The royal lawyer had arrived early, holding official scrolls with the royal seal. The time had come to make the king's decision known to the world. King Harold stood before his mirror, dressed in a simple royal coat. His expression was calm, though his heart carried the weight of the moment. This day would change how the people saw him, how they saw the royal family, and how history would remember them. Thomas, the royal guard, entered with a gentle knock. "Your Majesty, the lawyer has arrived. He waits in the grand hall." The king nodded. "Thank you, Thomas. Please make sure the gates remain closed until the announcement is done." "Yes, Your Majesty," Thomas replied, then left to follow his order. Outside the grand hall, servants moved quietly. The lawyer stood waiting near the royal desk, his hands holding the official documents. The sound of his pen scratching against the parchment filled the quiet room as he prepared the announcement text. Queen Camilla had not appeared yet. She remained in her chamber, sitting by the window as she had done for many mornings. Anna, her maid, tried to comfort her. "My lady, the lawyer has arrived." "The announcement will be read soon," Anna said softly. Camilla nodded without turning away from the window. "I know, Anna. It will be read with or without me. Do you wish to attend, my lady?" After a moment, Camilla stood up. "Yes, I should face what I helped create." She walked toward her wardrobe, choosing a plain but elegant gown. For the first time, she did not wear jewels or her crown. She only placed a small silver brooch on her dress, a gift from the king many years ago. When she stepped out of her chamber, the guards straightened in respect. Though whispers followed her, no one dared to speak. Her steps were graceful, but her heart felt heavy. In the grand hall, King Harold stood beside the lawyer. When he saw the queen entering, he gave a small nod. She walked to the opposite side of the room and stood silently. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Neither spoke, but in that look 1,000 words were exchanged. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Majesties, shall I begin?" The king gave a calm nod. "Proceed." The lawyer opened the scroll and began reading in a clear voice that echoed through the marble walls. "By the command of His Majesty King Harold of the Royal House, it is hereby declared that the marriage between His Majesty and Her Majesty Queen Camilla shall be dissolved by mutual consent. This decision is made with respect and in recognition of the peace and well-being of both parties and the kingdom." Every word felt like a weight in the air. The servants standing at the edge of the hall lowered their eyes. The king kept his head high, showing no emotion. The queen stood still, her hands clasped together. When the lawyer finished reading, silence filled the hall. The sound of the royal clock was the only thing breaking the stillness. The lawyer then presented 2 scrolls. "Your Majesties, your signatures are required." The king stepped forward first. He took the quill, signed his name with a steady hand, and placed the quill back on the table. Then he stepped aside. Queen Camilla walked forward next. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the quill. She paused for a moment, looking at the paper. Her eyes softened as she saw the king's signature written before hers. Then with quiet grace, she signed her name below his. The lawyer rolled up the scroll and sealed it with the royal emblem. "It is done, Your Majesties. The separation is now official." The king looked at the lawyer and said calmly, "Make sure this message reaches the council and the people before noon." The lawyer bowed and left quickly, carrying the document in his arms. When he was gone, the hall felt strangely empty. Only the king, the queen, and Thomas remained. Camilla turned to face the king. "Harold," she said quietly, "I never thought it would end this way." The king looked at her gently. "Neither did I, Camilla. But sometimes endings are needed so both hearts can breathe again." She looked down, her voice soft. "I was proud, Harold. I wanted to be seen, to be admired. I forgot what truly mattered." He took a slow breath. "You were not alone in forgetting. I too lost myself in duty and silence. But now maybe we can both find peace and truth." Camilla nodded slightly. "Peace is all I hope for." The king gave a final bow of respect to her and turned to leave. As he walked out of the hall, the echo of his footsteps lingered behind him. The queen stood there for a moment longer before quietly returning to her chamber. Outside the palace, the announcement spread quickly. By midday, the entire city was talking about it. The people were shocked but not cruel. Many respected the king for his honesty and calm decision. They said he had handled the matter with dignity, without anger or blame. Merchants, scholars, and common folk gathered in small groups discussing the news. Some felt sadness for the royal couple. Others admired their grace. But all agreed that their king had acted with a heart that valued peace over pride. Back inside the palace, Thomas was called once more to the king's study. The king was sitting by the window again, looking out at the cloudy sky. "Thomas," the king said, "you have served me faithfully through difficult days. You carried messages no one else could carry. I thank you." "It is my honor, Your Majesty," Thomas replied. "I wish to leave the palace for a while," the king said. "I will visit the royal retreat near the northern hills." "I need time to think, to rest," Thomas bowed. "Shall I make arrangements for your journey?" "Yes, only a few guards will come. It should be quiet." That evening, preparations were made. The king would leave the next morning. Queen Camilla was told of his plan. When she heard it, she asked Anna to bring her a small box. Inside it was a letter she had written to him but never sent. She sealed it with wax and asked Thomas to deliver it before the king's departure. When Thomas arrived in the study, he bowed and handed the box to the king. "Your Majesty, this was given to me by the queen. She asked that it reach you before you leave." The king looked at the box for a long moment. "Thank you, Thomas. You may go." After Thomas left, the king opened the box. Inside was a folded letter written in neat handwriting. He read the words slowly. "Harold, I may have lost the right to stand beside you, but I will always respect the man you are. Thank you for your kindness even when I did not deserve it. May your days ahead be filled with peace, the kind I could not give you." The king placed the letter back in the box and closed it gently. For the first time in many days, he smiled softly. The next morning, the royal carriage stood ready. Thomas and 2 other guards waited beside it. The king stepped out, dressed in a simple cloak without his crown. Before leaving, he looked once at the tall palace walls. He did not see the queen, but from her balcony, Camilla watched quietly as the carriage rolled away. She stood there until it disappeared beyond the gates. Inside the carriage, the king sat silently, watching the city pass by. The people bowed as he passed, their faces filled with respect. He felt the weight on his heart growing lighter with every mile. Back in the palace, Queen Camilla walked through the empty hall. She paused at the same spot where they had both signed the papers. For a moment, she touched the table and closed her eyes. Then she whispered softly, "May peace find us both." The palace stood quiet again, but this silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of pain, but the silence of calm acceptance. The royal couple had parted ways with dignity, and though the kingdom mourned the end of their union, they also admired the grace with which it had been done. The road leading away from the royal palace was quiet, covered in soft mist from the morning air. King Harold sat inside the carriage, looking through the window as the palace towers faded into the distance. For the first time in many years, he felt both sorrow and peace. The crown still belonged to him, but the heavy weight of a broken marriage was gone. Thomas rode beside the carriage on horseback, keeping watch as he always did. The 2 guards behind followed silently, their armor shining faintly under the pale light. The king had ordered that no royal flags be raised and that their journey remain humble. He did not want this trip to look like a royal parade. It was a quiet journey of reflection. After many hours, they reached the countryside. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of rain and grass. Farmers working in the fields looked up and bowed as the carriage passed, surprised to see the king traveling so simply. The king nodded kindly to each of them, his heart touched by their humble respect. By late afternoon, they arrived at the royal retreat near the northern hills. It was a small, peaceful estate surrounded by trees and a clear lake. The place was simple compared to the palace, yet it held a gentle beauty that made the king's heart feel lighter. When he stepped down from the carriage, Thomas bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, the retreat has been prepared. The caretaker awaits your orders." "Thank you, Thomas," the king said warmly. "You and the men have done well. You may rest now." Thomas nodded and went to help the others settle. The king entered the retreat and walked through the quiet rooms. The furniture was plain. The air smelled of wood and clean water. He opened the window and looked at the lake. The sunlight sparkled on its surface like tiny diamonds. For the next few days, the king spent his time walking through the forest paths and sitting near the lake. He began to write again, something he had not done for years. He wrote his thoughts in a small journal, not as a king, but as a man who wished to understand himself. Thomas noticed the change in him. The king looked calmer, spoke softer, and even smiled sometimes. At night, he would sit by the fire and tell simple stories to the guards about his youth, about the early days before the crown and the palace. One evening, as the fire burned low, Thomas approached him respectfully. "Your Majesty, may I ask you something?" The king looked up from his book. "Of course, Thomas. Do you miss the palace?" The king smiled gently. "The palace, perhaps, but not the life within it. I miss what it used to be, not what it became." Thomas nodded slowly. "You seem more at peace here." The king looked at the night sky. "Peace comes when we stop trying to control everything. I spent years trying to fix something that could not be fixed. Now I am learning to let go." At the same time, far away in the palace, Queen Camilla was learning the same lesson in her own way. Since the king's departure, the palace had become quieter. Many of the guests who once filled the halls were gone. The queen had sent away most of her attendants, keeping only Anna, her loyal maid. She spent her days walking in the gardens and reading old letters. The queen no longer wore her crown or attended royal dinners. She had chosen simplicity, perhaps for the first time in her life. One morning she found herself standing before the old oak tree in the royal garden. It was the same tree she and the king had planted on their wedding day. Its roots were strong, its leaves full of life. She touched the rough bark gently. Anna stood beside her. "My lady, it still grows beautifully." "Yes," Camilla said softly. "Even without our care, it keeps growing. Perhaps love is the same. It doesn't disappear, it only changes shape." Anna did not reply, but she could see tears forming in the queen's eyes. That evening, Camilla sat by her window as the sun set over the palace roofs. She watched the light fade and whispered a quiet prayer for the king's peace. Though their paths had separated, a part of her still wished him well. Days turned into weeks. In the northern retreat, King Harold's health and spirit improved. He began waking early, walking by the lake and speaking kindly to the local people who came to bring him fresh fruit and bread. He thanked them personally, something rare for a king. Thomas saw how the people admired him. They did not see him as a ruler sitting on a throne, but as a man who understood their simple lives. The king often said, "A ruler's greatest power is kindness." One afternoon, a young boy from the nearby village came running to the retreat with a small bundle. He bowed deeply before the king and said, "Your Majesty, the queen sent this for you." It arrived at the village post. The king took the bundle and opened it carefully. Inside was a single handkerchief embroidered with the royal crest and a note. The message was short. "May peace stay with you as it now stays with me." The king smiled softly, then folded the note and placed it in his journal. He turned to Thomas and said, "She has finally found peace too." Thomas nodded. Sometimes letting go brings both people home. That night the king sat by the lake looking at his reflection in the calm water. The moonlight touched the surface and he felt grateful for the quiet life he had found. He realized that peace did not come from winning arguments or holding on to broken things. It came from forgiveness, both of others and of oneself. He thought of the queen not with bitterness but with understanding. They had shared good times and bad, laughter and silence. Their story had ended, but it had taught him lessons that no throne could teach. The next morning, Thomas brought the king a message from the capital. It was from the royal council. They requested the king's return to the palace for an important ceremony that marked the kingdom's founding anniversary. The king looked at the letter thoughtfully. "It has been a long time since I stood in that hall," he said quietly. Thomas waited for his decision. Finally, the king folded the letter. "We will return tomorrow. The people must see that their king still stands strong, even after sorrow." The following day, the royal carriage made its way back to the city. When they reached the palace gates, a small crowd had gathered. People cheered softly, waving their hands in respect. The king smiled and greeted them kindly. Inside the palace, Queen Camilla waited in the grand hall. When she saw the king enter, she stood from her seat. For a moment, everything around them faded. The walls, the guards, the memories. Only two people remained, once joined by love, now connected by respect. Camilla bowed slightly. "Welcome home, Your Majesty." The king bowed in return. "Thank you, Camilla." Their words were simple, but their eyes said everything else. Neither needed to explain the past. Both had accepted it. That evening, the palace lights glowed again, not with celebration, but with quiet dignity. The king and queen attended the ceremony together, standing side by side before the people. There were no signs of anger or sadness, only peace between them. When the ceremony ended, the king looked out at the cheering crowd and felt something warm in his heart. The kingdom had survived its storm, and so had he. Later, as the night grew calm, the king stood once again on the balcony of his chamber. The same stars that had once witnessed his pain now watched his peace. He whispered softly, "Sometimes the end is only the beginning in a different form." Down in the garden, the queen walked beneath the oak tree, feeling the cool night air. She looked up at the balcony and smiled faintly. Both had found what they were searching for: peace, freedom, and understanding. The palace, once filled with tension and whispers, now rested in quiet harmony. The story of the royal couple was no longer one of sorrow, but of lessons learned and peace regained. The palace awoke to a soft morning light that painted the marble floors in gold. Though the grand halls were quieter than before, the air felt lighter. The tension that had once filled every corridor had begun to vanish, replaced by a calm sense of hope. The king had returned from his retreat in the northern hills, and the queen had begun to discover a different way of living inside the palace. King Harold spent his mornings walking through the royal gardens. He moved slowly, noticing small details he had never paid attention to before. A bird song, the scent of jasmine, the gentle sway of a tree branch in the wind. Each detail reminded him that life could be simple, even for a king. Thomas, ever loyal, walked beside him, observing the change in the king. His steps were lighter now, his smile calmer. The queen, meanwhile, had begun to spend her mornings in the palace library. She had always enjoyed books, but had rarely found time to read in her busy life as queen. Now she explored stories of faraway lands, histories of kingdoms, and the writings of philosophers. She realized that there was much to learn beyond titles and appearances. One morning, as the sun rose above the palace towers, the king and queen crossed paths in the hallway. For a brief moment, they simply looked at each other. There was no need for words. They had faced the past, understood it, and now both were ready to step into the future. The king nodded gently. "Good morning, Camilla." "Good morning, Harold," she replied softly. Their conversation was simple, polite, and free from tension. It was a conversation between two people who had once shared life, but had learned to respect each other even after parting ways. In the days that followed, the palace slowly returned to its rhythm. Servants moved with quiet efficiency. Guards stood alert but relaxed, and the townsfolk who visited the gates noticed that the palace felt warm once again. Though the king and queen were no longer married, their respect for each other created an atmosphere of calm that everyone could feel. The king resumed his meetings with the royal council. His decisions were thoughtful and patient. He listened to the advisors, but he also trusted his own judgment. He had learned the importance of balance and to lead with both heart and mind. The queen, too, found her own rhythm. She organized charitable events, helped the less fortunate in the city, and supported the arts. Though she was no longer the king's wife, she realized that her position still gave her power to make a positive difference. Her charm was no longer used for pride or appearance, but for the good of others. One afternoon, the king decided to visit the northern garden, where a smaller gathering of citizens had come to present gifts of flowers and fruits. Thomas accompanied him, as always, observing the warmth in the people's eyes. A young girl ran forward and handed the king a bouquet of daisies. She looked shyly up at him. "Your Majesty, we are happy you have returned. We hope you are well." The king knelt slightly and accepted the flowers. "Thank you, young one. Your kindness makes my heart happy." He stood again, glancing toward the palace. In the distance, he could see the queen walking along the same path, accompanied by Anna. Though they were apart, the sight of her smiling at the citizens reminded him of the peace they both sought. That evening, the king sat in the palace study writing letters. One was to a friend he had not spoken to in years, sharing his reflections on life, leadership, and peace. Another letter was for the citizens of the kingdom, assuring them that the palace would continue to serve the people with honesty and care. Across the palace, the queen wrote letters as well. She thanked friends for their support, shared news of her charitable projects, and expressed her hopes for a future filled with learning and compassion. Both the king and queen were building new lives, separate yet filled with purpose. Weeks passed, and the kingdom slowly adjusted to the new balance. The people admired the dignity of the royal couple. They saw that endings could be handled with grace and that respect could remain even when relationships changed. The palace became a place of calm, where kindness guided decisions and understanding shaped actions. One morning, the king invited Camilla to walk in the palace gardens. It was a peaceful day, with sunlight filtering through the leaves and the soft sound of water from the fountains. They walked side by side, not as husband and wife, but as two people who had shared a journey and learned from it. "Harold," Camilla said softly, "I never imagined we could find peace after everything. But here we are." The king smiled gently. "Peace is not about forgetting the past, Camilla. It is about understanding it and learning to move forward." She looked at him thoughtfully. "I have learned much about myself in these weeks, about humility, kindness, and the importance of using what we have to help others." "And I," the king replied, "have learned that letting go does not weaken a heart. It makes space for growth and understanding." They continued walking, talking about small things: the beauty of the gardens, the sound of the birds, the plans for the palace library. Their words were light, filled with curiosity and calm. The citizens of the kingdom noticed the change. They saw the king attending public events with dignity, and the queen supporting schools and hospitals with grace. They admired the way both had grown stronger in their separate paths. Their story became a lesson in respect, patience, and courage. Thomas, watching them from a distance, felt proud. He had witnessed history in a way that no ordinary person would. He had seen a marriage end without anger, without shame, and he had seen two people rise above the pain to find peace. One evening, the king and queen attended a small festival organized in the palace courtyard. Lanterns glowed softly, children laughed and ran freely, and musicians played cheerful tunes. The atmosphere was filled with happiness, gentle and sincere. The king looked at the queen and said, "It is remarkable how life can feel so full after so much silence." Camilla nodded. "It is a reminder that change is not always bad. Sometimes it is the beginning of something better." The festival continued into the night. Both the king and queen enjoyed the moment, not as rulers separated by distance, but as individuals who had found peace within themselves. Their hearts were lighter, and the palace felt alive with warmth and understanding. In the following months, the palace became a place of learning and growth. The king focused on fair governance, justice, and helping the people. The queen focused on compassion, charity, and nurturing the talents of young citizens. Though their lives were separate, they shared a common goal: the well-being of the kingdom and its people. One quiet evening, as the sun set over the palace, the king stood on the balcony and looked at the gardens below. He saw the queen walking among the flowers, her steps calm and confident. He felt a sense of gratitude. For years, they had faced challenges that could have led to bitterness. But instead, they chose understanding. They had turned the end of a marriage into the beginning of personal growth, peace, and hope. The palace, once a place of tension and whispers, was now filled with calm, respect, and purpose. The story of the royal couple was no longer one of sadness, but a tale of courage, dignity, and the power of letting go. King Harold and Queen Camilla had discovered a truth that few people ever learn: that life's greatest strength comes from kindness, understanding, and the ability to forgive oneself and others. As the night fell and stars twinkled above the palace towers, both the king and queen paused to look at the sky. Each felt a quiet happiness, knowing that the journey ahead was theirs to shape. Though their paths were separate, their hearts were free and their spirits were light. The royal guard, Thomas, watched from the courtyard, feeling proud and content. He had served the king faithfully, and now he could see that the kingdom was stronger, not in spite of the change, but because of it. In the soft night air, the palace glowed with calm and dignity. Life inside its walls continued, filled with learning, compassion, and hope. The king and queen, though no longer united in marriage, had found what they had truly sought: peace, freedom, and new beginnings. The story of King Harold and Queen Camilla became one remembered by the kingdom for generations. It was a story not of anger or loss, but of respect, understanding, and the courage to embrace life's changes with grace. And in the quiet of the night, the palace stood as a symbol of what can be achieved when hearts are open, choices are made with honesty, and endings are seen as a path to new beginnings.